Hi, everybody. So excited to see everyone here today. My name is Beth Banks Cohn, and I am the founder and president of ADRA Change Architects. I'll be speaking tomorrow, but today it's my extreme pleasure to introduce you to your next speaker, Sally Braley Parker. Sally is the co-founder of TimeZero Enterprises, an organization strategy, design, and development consultancy. Her work focuses on unleashing the life force of organizations as flourishing living systems, naturally innovative, productive, profitable, and healthy. Her passion is social process innovations that release the authentic power of the human spirit. The outcomes are inventive strategies, innovative designs, and transformed businesses grounded in a deep sense of purpose. Sally speaks and teaches globally on flourishing living systems, a living systems approach to thriving. She's authored numerous case studies and articles, and has also co-authored chapters in several books. Sally's presentation will challenge you to think differently about your organizations and the leadership needed to thrive. I, for one, am really looking forward to expanding my thinking about leadership and my role as a leader as Sally speaks. And so, Sally, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say.
Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning or good afternoon, whatever the case may be, everyone. And thanks for coming and for your interest in Sense and Respond. This is a passion for me and something I could talk about and explore for a full day. However, I think we have about 20 to 25 minutes. So I'd like to start with inviting all of you to imagine. Imagine that you are the CEO for an organization whose primary business is running schools and providing other services for youth who have been victims of trauma due to violence, social injustice, mental health issues, and poverty. Public schools really aren't designed to be able to meet the needs of these kids, and many of them are at risk of being involved in the juvenile justice system. These kids are near and dear to your heart, and you're watching them fall through the cracks due to conditions far beyond their creation and control. When you took over as CEO in 2019, enrollment in your primary program, which was your cash cow, had been consistently declining, and the cost models were upside down. The marketplace had been changing and was continuing to change, but your organization had been failing to respond sufficiently. You knew you needed to set a new strategic direction and fast. You also knew that this work should have been done 3 to 5 years ago, but signals had been ignored. Then COVID hit, the wheels came off, and the focus of you and your executive team was hijacked by the need to keep the doors open, which you did, thanks in large part to COVID relief funds and pure will. When your schools reopened, the needs of youth were more intense than ever. You lost staff, morale was at an all-time low. You were bleeding cash, and your team felt like it was in a state of constant triage. In the midst of all of this, however, you did set a new strategic direction and were able to engage the whole system in the process, both internally and externally. Huge milestone down. But efforts to activate strategically stalled due to the pull of day-to-day. The organization was continuing to bleed cash and talent. People were exhausted, at times pushed beyond their limits as the intensity of youth increased exponentially. You and your executive team felt torn between the need to respond to what was needed in the now and the need to execute strategically, which at this point meant a new business model. But you kept moving on both fronts. And as CEO, you continue to worry at what cost. Now, you've just completed an incredibly successful ideation session. You attracted leaders throughout your service ecosystem. You're now seen as a community leader, and you need to show results fast. So you're working to explore, vet, and launch pilot ideas that emerged, while many of your executive team members and key staff are being pulled into the weeds and, quite frankly, have little or no additional bandwidth for strategy. Your team is exhausted more than ever, and you're worried about the impact of sustained stress and trauma. You cannot lose any more key staff. And then you come into your weekly exec staff meeting, and one of your most successful programs has had its staff gutted by a competitor. You're now facing even more significant shortage of staff while trying to address financial concerns, increasing intensity of the youth you serve, safety concern, and what's feeling like a loss of hope. How do you lead in this environment? How do you know what to do? Where do you focus attention? And how do you support and lead your team? Traditional predict and plan approaches aren't going to work because there's just too much volatility, too much uncertainty, not to mention too much complexity. What's needed is being able to navigate this environment through a sense and respond approach. But what does that mean? Last March, I was in New York City and was able to hear a speaker by the name of John Marks Williams speak at the Business Agility Conference. And he shared a simile for this kind of agile leadership that really sounded perfect to me. He likened it to his prior life as a sports medicine therapist treating top athletes. And as he described it, he said his work was simple. You put your hands on your patient's body and you sense for two things. Where is the congestion and where are the pain points? Then you know where to palpate. For me, that is sense and respond leadership in a nutshell. You're looking for points of friction, congestion, and pain points, because those points are telling you where change, often small, is needed for your team or your organization to be able to increase its fit in a changing environment. And like John Marks Williams, once you sense those, you're able to know where and how to palpate the system, to ease constriction and tension, so you can release the flow. And as we think about sensing and responding in this kind of environment, for me, it's important to consider three premises. First, your organizations are alive. They are living systems. They are not machines. They're interconnected, complex, and adaptive, constantly changing. And to understand and lead in this, you have to pay attention to more than just the parts. You have to attend to the relationships between them. You also need to know and trust that the wisdom and the will needed to adapt, transform, and evolve is inherent in the system. You just need to create conditions for that wisdom to be released. Second, organizations exist in a state of dynamic non-equilibrium, which means that, yes, they are constantly changing, but they are not moving towards a new state of stasis or equilibrium. The idea of freeze, unfreeze, and refreeze does not make sense. Think about riding a bike. Your ability to be stable on the bike relies on your ability to retain and maintain balance through constant movement in changing conditions. And third, leading in this context is not business as usual. You can't use predict and plan entirely, and you definitely can't rely on command and control. It takes too long. There's too many layers. You'll never have enough information, and you can't afford not to trust. You need to be able to navigate without a map like the early pioneers, and you and your organization need to be able to continuously read signs, which means sense, and continuously respond. So let's think a little bit about the kind of dynamics that this environment is creating in our industries and our organizations. So many of you may be familiar with the term VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. This was a term that was actually coined in the late 80s and has been, for me at least, a very helpful framework in being able to better understand the forces shaping our experiences in organizations. But as these forces have continued to play out and we feel the sustained impact of COVID, we're now living in a world that is increasingly brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. This is now being referred to as a banny world, a term that was coined by Jemias Cassio. When we think about brittle, it's not the same thing as fragile. Fragile thing is delicate and can break apart easily. In contrast, brittle is solid and strong. The problem is it lacks flexibility. It doesn't bend. So when a certain stress level is hit, it breaks and shatters, often unexpectedly. Breaking points are often invisible. Weaknesses are hidden or camouflaged. And then the system is often at risk of unexpected stress and disruption. If we think back to our scenario, levels of disparity and inequity that have been inherent in education, mental health, and healthcare systems that have been there for decades. But during COVID, they were exposed. And not only did they create breaking points within school districts and systems and healthcare systems and hospitals, they also created breaking points for our at-risk families and youth, and for us as an organization. Anxiety, I think, is something I don't even feel like I need to describe. It's present everywhere. And today, anxiety is really being created by dilemmas or problems that don't feel like they have solutions, or the solutions that feel available to us don't feel useful or particularly desirable. And choices may have unexpectedly bad outcomes. In this kind of environment, trust is difficult, sometimes even impossible, because things that have been well understood suddenly seem alien, even false. Decisions that felt right no longer feel that way, and you're not so certain. Misinformation is a great example of this, whether it's political, economic, or personal. We've experienced that in our nation and at a world stage. In our scenario, misinformation has been rampant. And it's often been the result of things that aren't necessarily true, not enough information, lack of transparency. It's reduced levels of trust, it's undermined hope, it's driving decisions with unexpected outcomes, and it's creating confusion, a sense of deception, and is emotionally painful. Nonlinear systems, quite simply, are systems where inputs and outputs are disproportionate. There's a gap between cause and effect. I think we've long had the illusion of predictability, but we're really kind of bumping up against that illusion now. Nonlinear systems disrupt what we think we can expect to see as a result of decisions. Small changes can have unexpected outcomes and undesired effects. Bad decisions can spiral out of control. And nonlinear chaos is disproportionate, it's surprising, and oftentimes counterintuitive. And once again, in our scenario, these systemic inequalities had a disproportionate impact on our youth and our organization. The cause had been there for decades, but there had been a significant gap between that and its effect. And lastly, incomprehensible, which doesn't mean that we can't understand it. It just means that it is opaque, that the details or processes are so difficult to take in, and explanations are incomplete. Oftentimes, behavior from the outside realm, it's hard for us to find a rational understanding for that. And in our scenario, the ongoing impact of social and economic inequalities and inequities on our youth and on our organization has been difficult, if not impossible, to understand, much less plan or address. So in this context, when we think about sense and respond leadership, we need to focus on 4 things. Brittle systems need resilience. We hear a lot about resilience, about the capacity of a system or an institution, or even us as humans, to withstand sudden shocks and bounce back. But what's important here is that system resilience requires a buildup of resources so that it's a cushion or creates slack for the unexpected. Examples are tangible goods, such as storing up additional food supplies in the case of periods where availability may be limited. But I think more importantly, it's something less concrete, such as knowledge, which oftentimes is the first thing that gets a budget cut. Developing capacity inside of our organization, making sure that we have sufficient diversity of thought and perspective and lived experience. And the key point here is that a truly resistant system needs to be built up before a crisis hits. Anxiety needs empathy. Empathy is really the recognition and acknowledgement of negative effects of broken and chaotic systems on us as humans. It's a willingness to be kind and forgiving, even though we still have outcomes and results that we're accountable for. And that means to others and to ourselves. And it means being And it's critical to our ability to manage complexity. And this is something that I really want to underscore. Oftentimes we think that we need to dive into the metrics and technology, but we're finding more and more that the ability to be empathic and really build and strengthen connections helps us, like a stand of oak trees, where the roots are really connected beneath, be able to really withstand severe winds and storms and trauma. Nonlinear systems need improvisation, which means that there's an ability to respond quickly to unexpected changes and developments, be creative under pressure. It also means that we can't be restricted by predetermined choices. That, for me, is the definition of insanity, is we keep doing the same thing and expecting different outcomes. And last but not least is incomprehensible systems need intuition. The cool thing is that intuition lies within our own bodies and beings as leaders, and also within our organizational body. When we listen to our body's ability to recognize hidden connections, when we listen and pay attention to gut feelings, when something doesn't feel right, even if the data may be telling us a different story, especially if it's quantitative data. Our brains are remarkable systems of pattern recognition. Our subconscious minds can reach conclusions based on piecing things together that are there that in our conscious state we may not really be aware of or even noticing. Why? Because they are products of millions of years of biological insights, capable of reaching insights that we can't even fathom, but that we're there. So it's important that we pay attention to that. So where do we start? We start with people. Again, it's often easy to think we need to start with technology. We need to drive more metrics. We need to push harder. We start with people. How are they feeling? What are they saying? What are they not saying? What are they thinking? What are they doing? The complexity in systems stems for interactions and interrelationships between the parts. And people are always at the core of this. Plus, the chaos that comes from that banny world that I was just describing doesn't come from changes in geophysical systems or such. It comes from our inability as humans to fully understand what to do when pattern seeking and familiar explanations no longer work. We also need to shift between the dance floor and the balcony, as Ron Heifetz so beautifully describes it in Adaptive Leadership. Being on the dance floor allows us to experience dynamics from within and up close. It's like a micro view. It's like stepping inside of a forest and really being able to experience the trees. When we're up on the balcony, as leaders, we can step back and get a clear view. We gain a different kind of perspective of what's really happening. We can see patterns. We can look at the bigger picture. We're actually able to see the forest. Sense and respond also means that we need space for reflection, which is hard to grab today. Space for reflection allows us to make meaning differently, clearly, in collaboration, in community. So leaders and our teams can review and reflect on what's happening. It also allows us to pay attention to dynamics, tensions, and energy. So what helps us see that may be invisible to us? Well, I have found that a couple of tools have been incredibly helpful for me as I'm working in organization. First, there are 3 dimensions that anchor organizational context. First, for me, it's really understanding where's the ecosystem. I mean, as a consultant, that's one of the first things that I look at. If I'm a CEO inside of our scenario organization, what's going on in my ecosystem? For many of the organizations I work with, they're living in a complex, volatile environment. We could spend a lot of time talking about what that means, but the next thing that's really critical is looking at culture. Does it align? The challenge for me is that it often doesn't. Many organizations that I'm working with, they're still dealing with the cultures that are maybe not primarily directive, but heavily directive, moving into participative and flexible, but they're definitely not adaptive. And the second thing that I look at is where you and your leadership team and your organization is in your own cycle of growth and development, which is the graphic that's at the top of this cube. Won't be able to delve into that here, but I think is what is important to underscore is that many of the organizations I'm dealing with are in the space of knowing they need to transform, which means that they need to release. They need to release what no longer serves. They need to destructure programs and patterns and mindsets in order to release potential that they need for their next iteration. And they find themselves leading in liminal space, which means that they're in the space between what they were and what they are, which requires a tremendous amount of courage. Second, I sense for friction in the form of tensions, often created by multiple realities. Some of you may be familiar with polarity thinking or both and thinking. And one of the things that I find oftentimes when organizations are over-indexed, even polarized, it's because they're using either or thinking when both and thinking is essential. And you can experience this on the dance floor and you can see it up on the balcony. You may be seeing things like tension between long and short term, tactical and strategic, task and relationship, optimization and innovation, profit and purpose, unconditional and tough love. All of these are both ands. Thinking that you can choose one over the other is a false choice. The work of leaders is sensing where these tensions are playing out, how they're playing out and why, and creating conditions for expanding perspective so that there's space for multiple realities to be held and explored. So there's another great quote that I love. Thomas Hübel, some of you may be familiar. He's a spiritual teacher. And he talks about that it's not about knowing everything today, because we can't. It's about knowing how to move. A colleague of mine at a major manufacturing company the other day told me it's not okay not to know. It's okay not to know. It's not okay not to act. So how do we act moving forward? Well, we pay attention to what's emerging in the system. We use our intuition and all of the aspects of who we are to sense what's coming, even if it may not be fully there. We sense into the system. We get down to the dance floor, we get up on the balcony, and we sense what's emerging because it has huge, huge things to tell us. We make small experiments. We try small things and we see what happens rather than trying to manufacture or create these massive plans and roll them out. We try small things. Try them with yourself, with your leadership team. What if we do this? What if we do that? What happens? You get inside. It's like dancing. What happens when I do this? What happens when I move that way? You foster collaborations everywhere. You get people working together within and across, and not just within and across the organization, but across parts of your organizational ecosystem. And last, you act courageously as best you can, knowing that you may not know what you need to do, but you do know how to move. Thanks.
Okay, Sally, that was amazing. And so many things. I have so many things written down on my notes. We do have one question and we have a couple of minutes, so I'd love for you to answer it. We actually have more than one question, but most of the other ones were mine, so I can ask you anytime. So the question is, Sally, your BANI model, especially the need for empathy to address anxiety, parallels a different look at VUCA, where empathy is needed to connect on uncertainty and ambiguity before you can move to logical conversations on volatility and complexity. In your work, how are you seeing that need for empathy to play out, both from the executive standpoint and from the employee perspective?
So fabulous question. And I'm hoping that I will be up to the task of answering it quickly. So I think one of the first steps is recognizing that empathy isn't about being soft. empathy is an essential skill. In many ways, I think it's not only a soft skill, it's a hard skill, because it creates the space for people to be real, to be vulnerable, to show up, and to share what's there with them. But when they're not, that's essentially energy and capacity that's not available to you. So when you're talking about the alignment with VUCA and the need for the presence of ambiguity and uncertainty, you're not going to be able to. Ambiguity is really not knowing. It's multiple realities. So for me, it's really about stepping into that space of supporting your leadership team and yourself and looking at how do we expand beyond the tension of either or and truly be able to explore what's possible when we're looking at the both and. And I forgot the earlier part of that question, Beth.
So it was about there's empathy is needed to connect on uncertainty and ambiguity before you can move to logical conversations on volatility. And how are you seeing the need both from an executive standpoint and an employee perspective from the empathy?
So I think I was actually in a meeting with an executive team this morning that is in the midst of doing some innovation work. And one of the things that they were wrestling with is when and how do we engage folks? And the answer was you start now by doing it. Uncertainty, I think oftentimes we think we need to be more certain than we really need to be. And as I mentioned earlier, the wisdom is in the system. So what I do and I encourage leaders to do is get into the system and help the system, or ask the system to help you better understand what's needed, rather than feeling like you've got to come up with those answers yourself. So it kind of goes back to the act of experimenting. A futurist once said to a team of folks that we had pulled together, we need to let go of the idea of best practices. And we need to get really, really good at experimenting.
That's great, Sally. And unfortunately, we're out of time. So thank you so much. This has been quite interesting and effective. And I'm sure that your slides will be available to people. And of course, you're always available to talk to people offline. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much.